Let's talk about Devil May Cry.
Time to go to work, guys.
Devil May Cry. It's one of the greatest and most influential third-person action game franchises out there, and with good reason. I can list on one hand the number of games in this genre whose gameplay can even come close to the stylish and intricate combat present in most Devil May Cry games. Most. I've had a pretty long history with this franchise, from the moment I saw my uncle playing it on the PlayStation 2 back in 2003, to not being allowed to play it because it had the word devil in the title, to the time I first had the opportunity to own the original trilogy for myself in the form of the Xbox 360's Devil May Cry HD collection, back in 2012. I've sunk countless hours into the games in the series and have been a fan through thick and thin, so think of this retrospective as my own personal love letter to this monumental collection of games. Since I'm really good at starting video series about analyzing every game in a certain franchise but only doing the first game and focusing on something else, I figured I'd add yet another beloved series to the pile and go back to where many players first embarked on an adventure with the demon hunter Dante, the wisecracking, white-haired hero we all know and love. The story of the development for the original Devil May Cry is very well known. If you're a gamer, or someone who has been subjected to a gamer, you would know that Capcom project lead and Twitter blocking enthusiast Hideki Kamiya, whose name I definitely butchered, was working on a fourth Resident Evil title when he realized a game about an overpowered badass named Tony probably didn't fit too well in a tense survival horror game, and decided to make a completely different action game from the project that eventually became Devil May Cry. It's a tale as old as Onimusha Warlords, minus the tank controls. You can definitely tell Devil May Cry was supposed to be Resident Evil 4 from the atmosphere and camera angles alone, but the actual game feels nothing like a Resident Evil game outside of that. That's not to say the creators didn't do atmosphere well, quite the contrary. This giant spooky gothic castle would not be out of place in a Resident Evil game, or a more gimmicky Silent Hill title. And the soundtrack outside of combat is this ambient noise that conjures up images of a shadowy figure softly rapping at your door at 3 in the morning. It's jarring, because the main character Dante is this extremely stylish and flashy action hero type gallivanting around an abandoned demon-filled castle, like he's enabled God mode in a survival horror game. Even the guy that made the soundtrack knows this, because it quickly goes from a gloomy and mysterious piano piece to a simplistic but action-packed guitar riff looped over and over to signify that, yes, this party is indeed taking a turn for the crazy, and it is time to rock.
Jackpot.
This extreme superposition of the terrifying and the flashy is the key element of the atmosphere, which makes it so effective. It manifests itself in Dante's characterization here in a similar vein. He's not the depressed, brooding edgelord of Devil May Cry 2, nor is he the lighthearted Joker with some serious character development moments in Devil May Cry 3. I'd say he's kind of a mix of the two in a very primitive way. In every cutscene, he's either completely silent, a wisecracking hero who doesn't give a country fried fuck.
Are you the human, the son of Sparta who challenges the darkness for this?
Block off, Featherface, or you can stick around and find out the hard way.
Or a melodramatic soap opera character with moments of questionable voice acting.
I should have been the one to fill your dark soul with light!
I think the funniest part about this scene is that they were so confident in that voice crack that they echoed it like 3 or 4 times. That's not to say all of Dante's voice acting in this game is bad, just that it's more of a mixed bag since this is pre-Ruben Langdon Dante. The same goes for the other voice acting here. There are good voice actors and bad ones scattered throughout. Dante's characterization is not bad by any means either, it's just more crude than in later titles, where he becomes more complex and his personality achieves more nuance. He does have some sense of depth as shown in the plot twists that this game's surprisingly deep story has in store for the player, but it's still relatively simplistic, and when his demeanor takes a more serious turn, it feels more like a mood swing than an actual moment of character development. Aside from that though, I still really enjoy him in this game, because what I've always liked about Dante the most is that he's always a hero who strives to do the right thing, while still remaining a compelling and charismatic, character. Which is kind of refreshing, as most mainstream video game protagonists nowadays have the personality of a piece of determined sandpaper, and are morally gray because many video game writers think a protagonist has to either rescue an innocent kitten in one scene, or cut the line in Starbucks in another in order to be interesting. But I digress. Let's talk about some gameplay. I can say with extreme confidence that the gameplay for Devil May Cry 1 is still fun to the point of being addictive, and well-designed, despite being slower and simpler than later games in what the game reviewer known as Yahtzee coined as the spectacle fighter genre. This combat system defined this specific flavor of creative hack-and-slash games that are about chaining together stylish combos and achieving higher style ranks to power through the higher and higher difficulty levels that you unlock each time you beat the game. Though the style meter seems to be extremely nitpicky and immediately breaks when there is a single lull in the action, it's still very satisfying to whip up an S-ranked combo and just tear through demon ass, like you're a guy named Kyle's fist and they're a piece of drywall. It's also about prioritizing who to stagger so you don't get hit, as opposed to just dodging and blocking, which is nice because it means the best defense is a good offense and the momentum of the combat is not broken. The bosses are also very fair and satisfying to beat, but overall I'd say they were emblematic of how I felt when playing through this game again after having beaten it for the first and only time in 2012. It was a lot easier than I remembered it being. I even did some research to see if they had lowered the normal difficulty from the original PS2 version or the Xbox 360 version to the PC's HD collection, but they didn't. Only very specific difficulty spikes really gave me trouble, such as the encounters with the lion demons, the first phantom fight, and the third nightmare fight, but overall it was extremely easy. It was honestly a shock considering how brutally difficult these games are known for being, even on the normal difficulty, but I guess that's just the way she goes. If I were a betting man, which I'm not because I'm far too cheap to do that, I'd say Devil May Cry 1's difficulty and lack thereof comes from two factors: the simplicity of the combat itself, and the fact that weapons generally hit harder. The first one is very simple to explain. There aren't nearly as many combos as there were in Devil May Cry 3 onward, and the enemies are much slower, less numerous, and take longer to telegraph their moves. That means everything is much less chaotic and easier to control. Though there is some complexity in the form of changing weapons to suit the situation you're in, such as switching to the slow but high damage gauntlets to deal with these frosty boys, you're not going to be changing weapons on the fly or switching up your fighting style mid-combat like you would in the later titles. As for my second point regarding damage, everything does much more damage across the board. Enemies hit you much harder, but you also hit them much harder. That means, for instance, a single well-placed blast from the grenade launcher can kill a weaker puppet in one hit, or shred the health bar of our winged friend here. That's not to say the combat does not have its issues, and by that I mean issues springing from the fixed camera angles. I don't even know why I still bother mentioning the camera in PlayStation 2 games, because awful camera angles are an omnipresent force that plagues third-person action games from this era of gaming. Maybe one day I'll find the holy grail of camera angles, but this one certainly is not it. I think Devil May Cry is a very special case though, because it's not that you can't see what's going on, it's that the movements of the left analog stick change depending on the angle at which you can see Dante. It's really hard to explain in words, but you have to change analog stick directions for both performing combos and simply moving around the area, which can be really awkward if you're not used to it. Luckily, it's not uncommon for games to do this, so I took to the control fairly quickly, but it just felt like a relic of Resident Evil's awkward control layout. But hey, it could be worse. You could have tank controls like in Onimusha 1 and 2. And no, I'm not letting that go. Those are great games that are tarnished by that one thing. As for the level design, I talked about this in my videos for Onimusha Warlords and Ninja Gaiden Black, but I'm a sucker for level design that loops around itself and has the player progressively unlock more and more areas using key items in one giant castle or city. It gives you this meaningful feeling of progression. By showing you how far you've come and how your actions have shaped the area, and adds another layer of engagement by forcing you to pay attention to the environment and the objects and doors within. I really miss this kind of level design, born out of limited system resources, as you can only really find it in indie games nowadays. Even then, it's a more Metroidvania style, as opposed to a Resident Evil or 3D Zelda style of level design. One last thing I'd like to bring up is the user interface and quality of life features. It's not nearly as easy to switch weapons here as it is in the other games, but you'll only really need to use 2 different melee weapons, and you'll probably stick to 2 or 3 guns throughout the game. So it's not a huge deal to have to go into the menu to switch melee weapons or guns each time. If you die in this game, you either get sent to the beginning of the level, or you spend a yellow orb to be respawned at a checkpoint. I don't have a problem with this mechanic itself because the levels are fairly short, but I do have a problem with these yellow orbs automatically being used whenever you die if you have at least one in your inventory. They don't ask you if you want to use one, so even if you die at the beginning of the level, it's going to be spent whether you like it or not. This didn't get in my way too much, but if you're not as experienced with this game, be very wary of this and only buy a yellow orb when you know you'll need one. Also, make sure to save after every level, because you don't just restart the level when you die. You restart at the last save. That means if you finish a few levels without saving, and you die without a yellow orb, you're going back, pal. To conclude, Devil May Cry is a game that I'd label a must-play if you consider yourself a fan of the series, or a fan of third-person action games and or spectacle fighters in general. If you're trying to get into the series or genre, I'd still recommend it, because even though its lack of quality of life features and more dated graphics and design are still there, this is a very simple and addictive game to get your feet wet. Its basic yet innovative and stylish combat system, charming and memorable story and characters, and tight level design make this a classic that stands the test of time. I'd recommend grabbing this game with the Devil May Cry HD collection, which is on pretty much every modern platform. I'd say it's the best way to experience this trilogy of games, even if the menus are not well integrated and the price tag is pretty steep, but you can also pick them up for PS2 and play them on original hardware if you so desire. That's all, and thanks for watching. Creamy out.